Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Events in the Middle East have once again highlighted Europe's exposure to geopolitical shocks and energy dependencies. At the same time, Brussels has launched major new industrial and maritime initiatives. Are these policies connected to the changing global security environment? Well, to explore that question, we're joined by Tomasz Włostowski. He's the managing partner at EU Strategies and a regular contributor. Tomasz, welcome back to TVP World. Thank you for taking the time. So let's start with the, to make sure I get the name right, the Industrial Accelerator Act. What is it and how does the situation in the Middle East impact on it?
Well, basically, I think the situation in the Middle East sort of takes us back to the origins of the Green Deal, essentially, because if we recall correctly, in the last term, the European Commission, started rolling out the Green Deal, which, let's just remind everybody, was supposed to limit European Union's exposure to importation of fossil fuels, reduce our emissions. The war in Russia attacked Ukraine and the war broke out. And essentially, there was a bit of a hesitation in Europe. Well, should we continue decarbonization or should we just sort of stop because of the global events? But very quickly, the Commission decided, well, actually, the fact that the prices of energy are going up and, Russia stopped exporting gas, it just shows that we should really sort of move away from importation of fossil fuels. And we embarked on that. Now, the new European Commission came in and basically decided, look, maybe the costs of decarbonization are growing too high, European competitiveness is deteriorating, so maybe we should sort of liberalize a little bit all the things we did under the Green Deal. But apparently, the global events remind us again why we were trying to move away from fossil fuels and why, again, we have to, decarbonize industries as much as we can. Because let's remember, Europe doesn't have its own sort of sources of fossil energy. I mean, in Poland, we have coal, which, let's just remember as well, it's quite expensive. We have really no oil. We don't really have much gas in Europe, so we're importing everything. And the events in Iran really show how dependent, again, we are, because let's also note that the prices of energy just went up really, really quick. So the Industrial Accelerator Act, what it's supposed to do, it's supposed to facilitate rolling out the sort of decarbonized clean technologies in Europe and create markets, at least that's what the Commission hopes, for all these sort of decarbonized products, which are quite expensive to produce. And until now, it's very difficult to find sort of offtake markets for them because, again, the more we decarbonize the product, the more expensive, unfortunately, it is, and somebody has to buy it. And so far, there hasn't been really a demand market. So the Industrial Accelerator Act is supposed to create sort of demand for these decarbonized green products, essentially.
OK, so it sounds as though there's a balancing act here. The cost and the time taken to produce these decarbonised products and actually getting them sold with the rising price of oil as a result of the war in Iran. But I mean, it's a major investment, a major commitment for the EU to take at this time when there are so many other demands on its resources. And I'm thinking in particular of the Ukraine-Russia war, but also of bolstering up the European military capability. What's the attitude towards that balancing act?
Ashim, you've hit the nail on the head, which is the main problem that's been that the sort of green transition in Europe has been plagued with. Essentially, because decarbonizing, of course, is in general, sort of in the human sense, it's desired, right? Because we're going to be using less fossil fuels, we're going to be less polluting the environment, so it's good. Unfortunately, it's just expensive. And when it's expensive, somebody has to pay. Somebody has to pay for the new decarbonized products. So, I'm thinking decarbonized steel, decarbonized cement, decarbonized chemicals. Somebody has to pay for it. And, the consumers, they don't want to pay more for expensive products. In our, previous talks, we've discussed, for example, farmers protesting the Mercosur, and farmers have been protesting rising prices of fertilizers. Well, the farmers don't care if the fertilizer is decarbonized or not. They want a cheap fertilizer. So somebody has to pay. At the end of the day, it's the governments that will have to pay. And that has been the problem all along. And you're very right to point out that, well, with all the sort of new demands on the European budget, that be that defense, be that the infrastructure, be that the agricultural policy. We also have to subsidize basically decarbonization, and where to find the money for that, we don't really have a clear answer. The Industrial Accelerator Act, what it seeks to do, it seeks to create preferences for these green products in government procurement. But the government procurement is also spending public money. So, for example, if we're building new roads, or if we're building, or if the government's buying new cars, well, there's going to be green steel in them. There's going to be green cement in them, or decarbonized cement at least. But again, those things will be more expensive. So we are trying to square the circle here, because there is not much public money, and the demands on that public money are increasing from all sides.
So what is the stage of acceptance of this act? Is it likely to actually go through the process of finally coming into force?
Well, look, essentially we have, well, it has a lot of support in the industry, because let's just recall again, the industry has been under intense pressure to decarbonize. And as we've mentioned already, it was finding it very difficult to find offtake markets for these much more expensive green products. So the industries are tackled, so that are touched by this. So I'm thinking steel here, I'm thinking cement, I'm thinking aluminum. Well, they are somewhat probably happy. They're still sort of reading through the act and trying to understand how it's going to work. Well, they have preferences for their green products in government procurement. But, this is not a solution for the entire sort of European industry that's also under pressure from climate legislation. So, at the end of the day, maybe steel, maybe cement, maybe aluminum will be happy with the act, but then all the other sectors which are still under pressure to decarbonize, there's still not an answer for them. And their costs are rising, and the cost of production is rising, and their profitability is decreasing. So this is a partial response and a partial solution, but we're still far away from solving the overall puzzle of how to decarbonize the entire European industry.
Right. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, because critics of this act have said that this is simply protectionism under a different name. Should exporters to the EU be concerned by this act?
Well, thanks for pointing this out, because one of the controversies around the act was, well, we're basically creating preferences for EU-made things. For example, if you're going to be subsidizing or public tenders for construction, well, 25% of steel has to be not only decarbonized, but it has to be EU-made. Depending whether it's steel or aluminum or cement, there are different rules for different projects. Basically, yes, we're creating domestic preferences for various sectors. And yes, well, for the exporters from a lot of countries, this will be probably violative of the WTO or of the various free trade agreements they have with Europe. But the European Commission has concluded that the world of sort of free trade liberalization and of sort of free trade and openness of government procurement is ending, because everybody seems to be sort of protecting their own markets. So Europe has decided, well, if we want to decarbonize, then we have to also create a special market only for our own decarbonized products, and that's essentially the origin of this legislation.
OK, well, we shall wait and see what happens to this act and whether it gets through. Now, there is another statute that I wanted to raise your thoughts on, and that's the maritime and ports strategy. Now, this is also causing a bit of a stir. What's it about?
Well, exactly. This is the other aspect of sort of Europe's attempts to find its place in the world. Europe used to be a maritime power. Our role is sort of decreasing both on the sort of ship production side and, in the maritime shipping and in maritime in producing ships. We used to have about 20% of shipbuilding capacity. Now we're down to, I think, 5 or 6%. Essentially, these two communications, one on the industrial maritime strategy and the EU port strategy, they're tackling different aspects of EU sort of maritime attempts to sort of rebuild our power. So on the maritime side, the Commission is proposing a lot of sort of new investment into decarbonized fleets, into new creating an uptake market for sustainable fuels, for clean propulsion systems in ships. We're trying to find essentially a niche in the global shipbuilding market for European products, where the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese have really pushed us out of the sort of regular cargo market. So we're trying to find a niche in the more sophisticated ships. Now, for the ports, there is again a major concern about the growing foreign investments in European ports. We have the famous story of the port of Piraeus and Rotterdam and Valencia, where there's a lot of Chinese investment, and there are concerns about what that means for the European security. So the Commission is proposing various attempts to guide and monitor these foreign investments. There are other aspects as well: security of the port, making sure that we know who we're hiring to handle the port. There's an obvious vulnerability in the ports because they're the entry systems into Europe. So the Commission is trying to make sure that we know who's handling that and who owns those ports, because again, those are the doors to Europe, so to speak.
It does. I mean, it does sound strange that that the EU is allowing such enormous investments in the port system by the Chinese and by countries outside the EU. Does that reflect a systemic oversight by the European Commission?
Well, this is the big, let's be honest here, this is not only the issue for the European Commission, because it's also about the member states. I think if it was only to the European Commission, then probably at the point in time now, the Commission is quite already protectionist and conservative. However, the countries, let's remember, the countries are fighting for investment. The Greeks have been very happy to accept Chinese investments into Piraeus. There was a big debate in Germany whether to allow Chinese investment in Hamburg, and essentially, eventually, the investment was limited to a smaller share, but it was allowed. So it's not only the European Commission, because, as we've already discussed, there is shortage of funding for these big infrastructural projects. And China, as we know, is one of the superpowers in the world, investing not only in Europe, but also in Africa, in some of the other countries where we're trying to actually compete with them to make sure that we get our share of that investment. But the view from Brussels is different than the view from capitals. And the capitals are generally very happy to take Chinese money if it means more jobs and renewed infrastructure that they could not find investors domestically.
Right. Well, complex as always, but thank you very much for clarifying the situation, Tomasz. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.